世界は常に変化する。15番目だ。
Geez, Final Fantasy 15? Have you ever stopped to think about just how many Final Fantasy games there actually are? Because there's a lot more than 15. Let's talk about that. Gnoggin. First, though, let's answer that other question. Why is it called Final Fantasy when there are so many of them? Well, it wasn't originally going to be that way. Square was in big financial trouble at the time and expected to only make one more game before they stopped altogether. They were out of money, so they named the game Final Fantasy, as it was their final game, and it was a fantasy title, in case you didn't know. However, Final Fantasy was met with huge success. It sold almost 500,000 copies and got great reviews. They had the money to continue, and they did, and now that Final Fantasy became a well-known name, they had to stick with it for future releases of the series. So they did, and today Final Fantasy is one of the top-selling franchises in gaming. Now, as for how many are there, it all started in 1987, with the first one. Then came 2 and 3. In this time, they also released Final Fantasy Legends 1, 2, and 3 on the Game Boy. Also Final Fantasy Adventure. Then came 4, 5, 6, and Mystic Quest on the Super Nintendo. Mystic Quest being the first with a targeted audience of Americans, and boy, it shows what the Japanese thought of us back then. That game is ridiculously simple and still explains everything to you in great detail. Americans aren't that dumb, Japan. Sheesh. Final Fantasy then made a jump to the PlayStation and released Final Fantasy VII, which of all the Final Fantasy games still has the highest average rating of 94%. It was also technologically revolutionary, showing the true power of the PlayStation and how far gaming has come, and how good music composition can really change a game dramatically for the better. Then came Final Fantasy Tactics and Chocobo Dungeon, and soon after that, Final Fantasy VIII, which is often compared to 7 in greatness. 9 then came out, and so did that movie, Spirit Within. But this is about games. Then came Final Fantasy Chocobo Racing and Chocobo's Dungeon 2, and speaking of the Final Fantasy subseries Chocobo, there has since been few others. Final Fantasy Fables Chocobo's Tales and Chocobo Dungeon are the most well known here in North America, but there is also Chocobo on the Job, Chocobo Everywhere, Chocobo Land, a game of dice, Chocobo Everywhere 2, Chocobo Everywhere 2.5, Chocobo Everywhere 3, Choco Mate, Chocobo Demobile, Sid and Chocobo's Mystery Dungeon, Chocobo and the Magic Picture Book, Chocobo Panic, Chocobo's Crystal Tower, Chocobo's Chocado Farm, and their soon-to-be Chocobo Racing 3D. Now back to where we were, there was Final Fantasy X on the PS2. This game is tied with 8 for second place in the highest ratings category, with a 92% average. This game was also revolutionary for the time. It put the PS2 to its limits and actually had real-time facial expressions and voice. Really, they advertised that as a selling point on the box, how far we've come. Then came Final Fantasy XI, the MMO, and Tactics Advance, which isn't just a remake of Tactics. We've skipped a few remakes, as I'm not counting them. There's also Final Fantasy Tactics A2 on the DS, Tactics The War of the Lion on PSP, and Tactics S on iOS and Android. Also, Final Fantasy XI has 5 expansion packs, but they are just that, expansion packs. In this time, there was also 2 Final Fantasy Unlimited games, based on the Final Fantasy anime with the same name. Then came Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles on the GameCube, and since then, we now have Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles Ring of Fate, My Life is King, Echoes in Time, My Life as a Dark Lord, and The Crystal Bearers. Final Fantasy VII Before Crisis then came out. Then that Advent Children movie came out, as did Dirge of Cerberus, and Dirge of Cerberus Lost Episode, a sequel to 7. So now there's 5 Final Fantasy VII games, and a movie, and an anime. Then came Final Fantasy XII and a year's worth of remakes, followed by Final Fantasy XII Revenant Wings, and Final Fantasy XII International Zodiac Job System. Then came Final Fantasy Crystal Guardians, Crystal Defenders, and Crystal Defenders Vanguard Storm a year later. Final Fantasy IV The After Years then came out. Man, you're already at 12 and you're just now getting around to making a sequel for 4? To be fair though, they did release a remake of 4 the year prior. Then comes Dissidia, and soon after that Dissidia 012. 012. How am I supposed to read that? 012? Between those two, however, came Final Fantasy XIII and the 4 Heroes of Light. Then came Final Fantasy Type 0, and then Final Fantasy XIII-2, Then came Threat Rhythm, a Final Fantasy rhythm game on the 3DS. Final Fantasy Dimensions then came out bit by bit, selling it episode by episode. Final Fantasy Airborne Brigade followed, as well as Artnix and all of the bravest. Now it was time for the second Final Fantasy MMO, Final Fantasy XIV. And now we await Final Fantasy XIII Lightning Returns and Final Fantasy XV. Ugh, I forgot Final Fantasy X too. How can I forget X too? That's like the best one. Now for those of you who don't think I should have counted the sub-series Chocobo in here, here is the number of games that actually have the words Final Fantasy in the title. It's still pretty big. But for those of you who do think that I should count the spin-offs, I'm not done yet. There are still a few more, and let's cover those now. Kingdom Hearts is a crossover of Final Fantasy and Disney, and there are a bunch of those. Kingdom Hearts 2, soon to be 3, Birth by Sleep, Coded, Chain of Memories, Dream Drop Distance, X, and 358 over 2 days. I mentioned Final Fantasy Adventure. Well, that spawned the Mana series, which now includes Secret of Mana, Children of Mana, Dawn of Mana, Heroes of Mana, Legend of Mana, and Seiken Densetsu 3, and Sword of Mana. The Final Fantasy Legend series soon became its own series too, called the Saga series. There are 3 romancing sagas, 2 Saga Frontiers, and Unlimited Saga, making the total number of Final Fantasy games and Final Fantasy spin-offs at... And they are continuing to make more, and we gladly accept them because most of them are great games, and really, if a series ain't broke, don't get rid of it. So many of the Final Fantasies are original to the other Final Fantasies, but they all share a name, and share one multiverse. And if you're a fan of the series, or if you're not a fan of the series, it's been a long time and it's going to be here for quite a while longer. Just you wait, it'll be a huge deal when they reach number 100.
Final Fantasy is an RPG, the only one that I need. It's the RPG for me. Final Fantasy is all that I play.